Something happened yesterday that most people covered as an oil market story, and almost nobody covered as what it actually is. The United Arab Emirates left OPEC. 59 years of membership gone, effective this Friday. And the reason their own energy minister gave for the timing tells you more about the real state of this war than anything said at a press conference in the last 60 days. He said the timing was chosen because the Strait of Hormuz is closed and the market impact of leaving will therefore be limited. Read that carefully. The UAE is not treating the strait closure as an emergency that ends next week. It is treating it as a stable enough condition to plan around, to use as cover for a major structural economic decision. That is America's closest Gulf ally, sitting directly across the water from Iran, telling you through a production decision what it actually believes about how long this situation lasts. Not what it says publicly, what it believes. I spent decades watching how governments signal their real assessments versus their public statements. And when an ally stops asking permission and starts building the next structure on its own, that tells you something important. It tells you what that ally thinks the current structure can no longer provide. Now, let me connect this to something else that broke in the last 24 hours, because these two stories together paint a picture that neither one paints alone. Iran is running out of places to put its oil, and the people running Iran are quietly asking Russia if they can leave. Let me take you through all three of these simultaneously because they are not separate stories. They are the same story told from three different angles. Start with Iran's oil storage crisis because the numbers are genuinely alarming, and I want to be precise about them. Karg Island is Iran's main crude export terminal. It processes roughly 90% of Iran's energy exports. Right now, with the American blockade preventing tankers from loading and departing, oil is flowing into Karg Island storage at a rate of approximately 1.1 million barrels per day with nowhere to go. As of this week, analysts estimate roughly 13 million barrels of spare onshore storage remain at the terminal. At current inflow rates, that storage fills completely in 12 to 13 days. We are talking late April to early May, which is right now. Iran's response has been to drag a 30-year-old decommissioned tanker called the Nasha out of retirement. This vessel had been sitting empty at anchor for years. Iran reactivated it as floating storage to absorb some of the overflow. Analysts looked at that move and said it buys Iran approximately 2 million additional barrels of buffer, which against 1.1 million barrels per day of inflow buys less than 2 days. One analyst described the Nasha as, and I am paraphrasing, not much. Now, here is the part that I think most coverage misses completely. You cannot simply turn off an oil field the way you turn off a faucet. Iran's extraction and refining infrastructure was not designed for sudden shutdowns. If storage fills and Iran is forced to halt production at Karg Island, the pressure buildup in the upstream wells creates serious geological problems. Wells that are abruptly shut in can suffer permanent formation damage. Analysts are already reporting that Iran is increasing flaring at production sites, burning off associated gas at elevated rates as an emergency pressure release valve while they figure out what to do. If forced shutdowns happen and well damage occurs, the recovery is expensive, slow, and in some cases impossible. Iran could be looking at permanent destruction of productive capacity in its most critical oil fields, not just lost revenue for the duration of this war, permanent structural damage to the foundation of its economy for decades. The Treasury Secretary said publicly this week that Iran's main export terminal is soon nearing storage capacity, which could force Tehran to cut production and lose approximately $170 million in daily revenue. That figure, $170 million per day, is on top of the blockade damage already accumulating, and the mechanism causing it is not bombs, it is mathematics. Oil going in, nowhere to go out, storage filling, wells under pressure. Now layer onto this what America did yesterday on the buyer side. The Treasury Department issued a formal warning to financial institutions globally that they face secondary sanctions exposure if they engage in transactions with Chinese independent refineries that process Iranian oil. These are the so-called teapot refineries, smaller independent Chinese processors, primarily in Shandong province, that have collectively been buying approximately 90% of Iran's oil exports throughout this conflict. America sanctioned one of the largest of these refineries directly this week, along with 40 shipping companies and vessels connected to Iran's shadow fleet. And yesterday's warning extended the threat to any bank anywhere in the world that touches a transaction involving these refineries. China buys roughly 90% of Iran's oil. America just told every bank in the world that handling the financial transactions for that trade risks cutting them off from the American financial system. For most international banks, that is an existential threat. The American dollar clearing system is not optional infrastructure for a global bank. It is the infrastructure. Losing access to it is not a regulatory inconvenience. It is institutional death. The practical effect is that Iran's only meaningful buyer is now facing a choice between continuing to buy Iranian oil and maintaining access to the global financial system. And the signal from Beijing has been notably cautious. China's foreign minister met with Iran's foreign minister this week and said Beijing opposes illegal unilateral sanctions. That is a diplomatic statement. What China's teapot refineries are actually doing is a different conversation. Several of the larger independent refiners have already reduced Iranian oil purchases since the sanctions pressure intensified. The shadow fleet tankers that move the oil using transponder manipulation, ship-to-ship transfers in the Strait of Malacca, blending Iranian crude with Malaysian crude to disguise its origin, are now being sanctioned individually as the Treasury identifies them. 40 vessels this week alone. So put this together. Carg Island filling to capacity in days, wells facing potential permanent damage if forced to shut down. The one significant buyer being told by American sanctions pressure to choose between Iranian oil and the global financial system, and a 30-year-old decommissioned tanker dragged out of retirement as Iran's solution. This is the economic picture that the UAE's energy minister looked at when he decided now was the right time to leave OPEC. Not just the strait closure as a temporary crisis, the entire economic architecture of Iranian oil export under simultaneous pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. And Abu Dhabi, sitting 60 miles across the water, watching all of it in real time, made a decision about what comes next. Now, I want to tell you the third piece of this story, the one that is hardest to say clearly, but that I think the evidence now compels. Senior Iranian regime officials are negotiating asylum arrangements in Russia. Khamenei's deputy chief of staff and longtime security advisor has been in contact with Russian officials about securing an evacuation for himself and his family if the situation deteriorates. Other senior officials are finalizing exit routes. Netanyahu said publicly this week that senior Iranian leaders are already packing their bags. Multiple intelligence-sourced reports confirm that regime figures are pursuing what one report called emergency exit options, including Russian connections. The template they are using is not hypothetical. It is Bashar al-Assad, the former Syrian president, when his government collapsed in November 2024, was extracted to Moscow within hours. He is there now, living under Russian protection. The Iranian officials making these arrangements are explicitly modeling their contingency planning on what happened in Damascus. Russia took Assad in. Russia is the logical destination because China, despite its strategic partnership with Iran, has made clear it does not want to become a sanctuary for fallen regimes. Venezuela is no longer viable. Turkey's relationship with Tehran has deteriorated. Moscow is the exit. Here is the question I want you to sit with. Russia is simultaneously Iran's most important external patron in this conflict, providing satellite intelligence, radar systems, diplomatic cover at the Security Council, and apparently the destination that Iran's own senior officials are quietly preparing to flee to if the regime fails. What does it mean that the people running Iran are hedging against the failure of the very cause Russia is supposedly supporting? It means that at the highest levels of the Iranian government, there is a gap between the public posture. We will never submit. Iran does not negotiate under pressure. Our initiative is coming, and the private calculation, which is that powerful people are making personal contingency plans for the scenario where the regime does not survive this war. Those are not the same calculation. and you cannot hold both of them simultaneously without one of them being dishonest. Russia's position in all of this is worth examining honestly. Moscow is a country currently fighting its own war in Ukraine, absorbing enormous economic pressure from Western sanctions, managing its own political risks at home, and simultaneously being asked to serve as Iran's intelligence partner, Iran's diplomatic shield at the United Nations, and apparently Iran's emergency evacuation service for senior officials if things go wrong. Russia has interests in this conflict. It benefits from high oil prices, from American military resources being consumed in the Gulf rather than sent to Ukraine, from the erosion of American credibility with Gulf allies. But Russia also has limits. It cannot save the Iranian regime militarily. It cannot buy Iranian oil at scale to replace what China is reducing. It cannot prevent Karg Island from filling up. And if the regime does fall, absorbing 20 senior Iranian officials and their asset networks creates its own complications. The UAE leaving OPEC, Karg Island approaching storage saturation, America systematically dismantling the financial infrastructure of Iran's shadow oil trade, senior regime officials negotiating their personal exits with Moscow. These are not four separate news stories. They are four symptoms of the same underlying condition, a conflict that has now lasted 60 days and is beginning to produce the kind of structural, irreversible changes that make the world before February 28th impossible to restore, regardless of what any ceasefire says. The question is no longer whether this war ends, it will end. The question is what the region looks like after it ends, and the answer being written right now in Karg Island's filling storage tanks, in Abu Dhabi's departure from OPEC, and in the quiet conversations between Iranian officials and Russian embassy staff is not the answer that either side publicly claims to be working toward. I am Lawrence Wilkerson. The gap between what governments say and what they do is always where the real story lives, and I will see you in the next one.